I want to discuss the returning jihadis that seem to be popping back up in greater numbers almost every week, actually. The Sunday Times reports that members of Britain's biggest suspected female terror cell are among scores of jihadi brides and their children who will be returning to the UK after being detained in Syria following the fall of ISIS. These include two sisters from East London, a white convert daughter of a former British Army paratrooper, and an IT graduate whose mother works in the NHS. They are part of this alleged cell, which is linked to some of the world's most infamous terrorists. We're told by this newspaper that as many as 80 British women and children are expected to return imminently. Some have had their British passports already handed back to them, and that British officials had issued some of the children with new travel documents. And one woman said she expects to be DNA tested to prove she is the children's mother. There are disclosures from the father of one of the women who has gone out there, a woman called Natalie Bract, one of the British women believed to be in detention after joining ISIS. John Brown is her dad. He's a former British Army soldier, and he said this. He said, everybody deserves a second chance. And that encapsulates quite neatly the difficulty in this one about whether you think these women and children should be allowed to come back. One, perhaps because they're women and children, although does that make children? Yes, but for the women, does that make exclude them from their guilt of going out and joining this organisation in the first place? And two, whether you think that's true in the case of anybody who went out to fight for ISIS who's British, that they do deserve a second chance. One of the other people involved in this is a British-born man, Ashraf Mohammed Islam, who also went out to fight for ISIS and has appeared in an interview done by ITV News saying that he too hopes to return home. Guess what? He misses his mum's cooking. Don't go out and fight for ISIS then. We'll take your calls in a minute. First, to that ITV story and to their security editor who got it, Rohit Kachroo. Rohit, just tell us about this man who wants to come home. Good evening.
Good evening, Tom. Well, this man, as you say, is called Ashraf Islam. He was born in East London. He was brought up in East London, although he's lived for some of the last few years in Bangladesh. And we, over the last few days, managed to interview him. I mean, this was quite a restricted interview done by our producer in northern Syria. He withheld a lot of detail, so we actually had to do some of our own investigation work to double-check a lot of what he was saying. And frankly, to find out who he was, he didn't tell us, for example, about his background in Bangladesh, which is where he'd been living before he travelled to Syria. On Friday night, we managed to make contact with some of his family in the UK who described how this really came out of the blue. I mean, this is a familiar response that you hear from the families of people who go to ISIS. But to support that point, one of his family members gave me a piece of family footage in which he's joking about, he's dancing at a party, and this was all happening a few weeks before he then went to Syria. In fact, his family were told by the police in Bangladesh that he had gone to Nepal, and this was just the same time as the big earthquake in Nepal a few years ago, and so they were panicked, thinking that perhaps he'd been harmed there. But actually, it soon transpired that he travelled to Syria. He went to live under Islamic State group, and he was there subsequently for 2 years. And then he claims, and these are only his claims, that he decided he'd made a mistake, that he tried to leave. And so for the last few months, he's been in Kurdish custody. He was arrested by their forces there. Now, the question now is what should happen to him? Should he stay there? Should he go to Bangladesh? Should he come back to the UK? Now, he says home is where the heart is, in his words, and he wants to return to the UK, even if that means returning to a prison in the UK. The British authorities say that actually, no, that's not going to happen. They've sent him deprivation of citizenship notice, which means that he is no longer a British citizen. And they've been able to exercise that power because they say that he's a dual Bangladeshi national as well. But his family are quite clear on that. They say that he's a British citizen, and so they intend to challenge this letter, this ruling, through the courts in the UK. So.
And I suspect that the difficulty is, as you found in trying to corroborate some of this guy's story, the difficult for the courts here is precisely the problem you found. How do you piece together what these people may have done when there's limited evidence? It's in a war zone. It's in a country that's completely torn apart, which is probably why we've seen so few prosecutions of people that have been over there and come back to this country.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Tom. And you know, we spend a lot of our time when we're reporting on this issue focusing on a very small number of high-profile ISIS fighters, people like the so-called Beatles, you know, around which there is some evidence, you know, that they were part of this execution gang, evidence from their hostages who survived in France, in Italy, in Germany. Evidence, too, from what was placed on video in ISIS propaganda films. But for the vast majority of British citizens, you know, actually it's much more difficult to gather evidence of terrorist offences. And so, frankly, prosecutors in the UK know that there is very little, perhaps in many cases, no chance whatsoever of getting a prosecution against some of these people. Now, that's why the UK has sent out so many of these deprivation of citizenship orders, several dozen of them. But they've gone to people who they deem to be dual nationals because, you know, they do not want to make people stateless. They're prevented from doing that by international law.
Which arguably is an area that I suspect my listeners will want to see challenged. Why not make these people stateless when they've gone out to fight against, in some cases, British forces by joining ISIS, an organisation so antithetical to British values as to render them, frankly, enemies of Britain anyway. Rohit, great to talk to you. Great story. Thank you. Rohit Kachroo, security editor of ITV News. Do check out their story on this man, Ashraf Islam. Listening to that is Tasnime Akunjee, who is a terrorism and serious crime lawyer who you might remember represents the families of the Bethnal Green schoolgirls who travelled to Syria a few years ago, just teenagers when they did it. Tasnime, great to have you on the line. Thank you for joining us this evening. I wonder what you make of the returning 80 women. Do you know that it is that high a number, or are there more to come back imminently?
No, I don't, but I'm a bit troubled by your notion that your listeners en masse would want to challenge the fact that the British government is trying to make people stateless, because that would mean that the most of your listeners are against the rule of law and therefore should be referred to the prevent strategy, really.
Well, I suspect a lot of people are very concerned by the idea of people going out to join Islamic State, going to Raqqa, as we think these three girls from Bethnal Green may have done, and then coming back and being unable to be prosecuted.
And quite properly, the British government has a policy to keep undesirables, people who are not conducive to the public good, out of the country. So that would be, on one hand, the American far right, that some of which have been rejected from entering to the UK, and also other people who are accused of being extremists and what have you. Now, we refuse having other people's extremists come to our country. So it becomes imminently hypocritical of us to foist our extremists or terrorists onto other people, i.e. the YPG-controlled part of Syria at the moment. We should take responsibility for the people that we've fostered and have left and joined an organisation. We should deal with them under the rule of law and take responsibility for potentially our terrorists, like we expect everyone to take responsibility for their terrorists.
Even if that means that these terrorists might not see the inside of a court, as the statistics would show very few of them actually do.
Well, I mean, that would come down to what the evidence shows. And the difficulty here is that there are many people who have gone out to Syria for non-terrorist purpose. But if they have gone for terrorist purpose, and there's evidence of that, then it's incumbent on us to bring the evidence to prosecute them. Whereas the idea that, well, we're going to tar everyone, including very decent humanitarian people who went out for humanitarian purpose, and just say we're going to assume you're a terrorist and ruin your life and ruin your family's life, well, that's not what we stand for when it comes to justice.
And has that happened in cases of people you've represented?
Well, we've had people who were picked up in Turkey, not even in Syria, assuming that they were going to go to Syria, at the point of a gun, children being put in detention centres in Turkey, brought back to the UK, prosecuted, had Prevent come in, assuming that they were going to go over to Syria, it's just a family on holiday, basically, and their children are receiving therapy at the moment for the experiences that they had at the hands of the UK and the Turkish security services.
I mentioned the Bethnal Green girls, these 3 girls who went over to Syria. What is the latest on their status? Do we know where they are? Do we know if they're coming back?
Well, one was confirmed dead, and the others have gone quiet for over a year, so we're assuming the worst on them.
But there are other people who you deal with, indeed, perhaps you speak to, who have also returned from that country. What happens to them when they do?
Well, that again depends. Some who've come have been assessed by the police. There's been no evidence against them, and they've been allowed to go about their business. However, these are women, and in some cases, their children are taken away from them because of the assumption that they took them out to a war zone. So it really does. It's evidence-driven, as it quite properly should be, and so an assessment is taken of the evidence, and they're filtered through the criminal justice system or into child safeguarding principles are then applied to them if that's relevant.
But you are happy with, or at least you stand by, the letter of the law, which says, well, unless you've got the evidence to prosecute people who went out to, sometimes openly, join a terrorist group, a prescribed terrorist group, well, then let's see it, because they can face their day in court. Until that time, they shouldn't have their citizenship taken away from them.
Well, if somebody has openly said that they are going out to join a terrorist organisation, that falls foul of the existing terrorist legislation. They would be committing an offence, and they could be prosecuted for that. So, am I happy with the way the law operates? Not particularly, only because the rule of law isn't applied. We're just simply trying to suspend law on people and leaving them in limbo, or as problems for other people who are innocent of how they've been come to this situation.
So those people who are going to ring me up and say we should never accept these people back, you say you're acting illegally?
Absolutely, yeah.
And for those people who then want to see the law changed, and there has been proposals put forward to sort of classify travel to an area like Syria as in and of itself illegal, what do you say to that?
Well, again, the difficulty becomes that in every society we want to encourage the better angels of human nature, and that means we even have this as a system in a government-backed system of sending young people out on a voluntary basis to difficult parts of the world, including Africa and what have you, to do voluntary work there. And many charities are the only lifeline for those millions of people who are innocently affected by war in Syria, and they have turned into refugees. Now, we can't have it on our cake and eat it. We can't say we don't want any refugees coming to the country, but we also don't want anyone to go out and help them either in their home countries. It's basically ignoring the problem that leads to death. It's similar to the Bangladeshi famine created by Churchill back in the 1930s.
And finally, you think then that of these women, we think about 150 of the 900 or so who are believed to have travelled to join the jihadist group in Syria and Iraq, they should absolutely be allowed back into this country. And if the law catches up with them, so be it. And if it doesn't, then that's just the laws of our land and we have to stand by them.
Again, the difficulty is saying they should be allowed back. It's actually we should be taking responsibility for our citizens. So it's incumbent on us to go and bring them back. And, a lot of people would see them as criminals, and they would be brought back through a system which would be a secure system, i.e. they wouldn't be able to run off or what have you, and that's the process. And then the evidence would then be applied and see if any laws have been broken. But the idea that we as a country now stand for the idea that we just tar people willy-nilly just because we suspect something means that we're no different to the Nazis or Stalinist government.
That's what you think. You think that if we make people stateless on the basis of they may have committed a crime whilst also involved in ISIS, that is equivalent to the Nazis?
I would say so, yes.
I find that unbelievable.
Well, that's because you need to refer yourself to Prevent.
Because you think I'm an extremist?
Because you're not implementing the rule of law. If you don't believe in the rule of law, then you're not standing up for British values.
And the British values that prevent people like me from going out and fighting for ISIS against British values is redundant in an argument about someone who does.
Well, there are many British ex-soldiers who went and joined the YPG, which is a wing of the PKK. And for many years, actually, they were left to their own devices. But recently, the rule of law caught up with them as well. And a number of them have been arrested, and we'll see how that progresses. But to be fair, anyone who joins a terrorist organisation or is linked to a terrorist affiliate organisation should be and will be arrested, and the rule of law applies to them. And it's only fair that that's the case. Now, if we don't stand for justice and fairness across the board, then we don't stand for any sort of civilised society.
Tasneem, I'm grateful for your time. Thank you. Tasnime Akunjee, a terrorism and serious crime lawyer who represents some of the families of the Bethnal Green schoolgirls who travelled to Syria. What do you make of what you've just heard there? That if you are someone that thinks this man or these women, whoever, who have gone out to fight for ISIS, have perhaps said that they're fighting for ISIS, although we don't know what crimes they may have perpetrated whilst being a member of ISIS, they should be allowed home under the rule of law. And if the law catches up with them, so be it. If it can't provide the evidence to take them to trial, then is acted under the rule of law. And to do anything other is akin to tossing aside the rule of law in the way in which, as you heard Tasnime Akunjee say, the Nazis did. 0345 6060 973. We'd be lowering ourselves to that level if we stripped British citizens of their citizenship, having gone out to fight for ISIS in Syria. I mean, we'll take your calls in a moment. 11:19's the time.